We would like to explain the dismantling and assembling procedures for the operating water supply equipment, vertical shaft, upper bearing housing, horizontal shaft, and gear pump of the Excellence series. Before starting the dismantling work, please read the instruction manual and learn in advance the mechanism, inspection points, and inspection methods to ensure orderly and efficient work. Now, we will explain step by step the dismantling and assembling procedures for each part of the main body of the Excellence series. Before dismantling, confirm if the Selfjector has completely stopped running with the safety joint. Then begin dismantling work. To dismantle the main body, first remove the frame cover and bowl. Draw out the horizontal shaft and then draw out the vertical shaft. Remove the drain plug to drain the lubricating oil from the gear case. Remove the gear cover. If necessary, remove the motor wiring. When removing the wiring, memorize the wiring connections. If an error is made in connecting the wires, the motor will run in reverse. After setting the motor on a chain hoist, remove the 4 bolts located on the motor flange. A friction boss with friction blocks is fixed to the motor shaft. When drawing out the motor, be careful not to drop the friction blocks on the floor. Next, remove the connection tubes connected to the gear pump. Loosen the 6 bolts fixing the gear pump, and then remove it. Loosen the socket set screw setting the safety joint, and remove the safety joint. Take off the pump side of the bearing housing. First, remove the 2 bolts securing the bearing retainer. Draw out the 6 bolts fixing the bearing housing. Mark its position as shown. Screw the push bolts evenly into the 2 push bolt holes provided on the bearing housing, and then bearing housing is removed. Draw out the friction pulley. Release the locked bolt from the tooth of the tongued washer. Loosen the bolt with a T-type wrench and remove the bolt, tongued washer, and pulley washer. Set a jack and push bolts on the friction pulley and tighten the jack handle until the friction pulley is pulled out from the horizontal shaft. Draw out the horizontal shaft from the side of the gear pump. If the horizontal shaft is difficult to draw out by hand, apply a piece of wood on the side of the friction pulley and tap it. When drawing out the horizontal shaft by tapping, the spiral gear might be damaged if the horizontal shaft is dropped into the gear case. To prevent this from happening, have another person hold one side of the horizontal shaft. This completes the removal of the horizontal shaft. Next, the vertical shaft is drawn out. First, take out the operating water supply equipment. Remove the cap nut of the copper tube. The operating water supply equipment is important for operating the main cylinder properly. If this equipment becomes scaled or clogged, the prescribed amount of operating water is not supplied to the pressure water chamber of the bowl, resulting in defective discharge or no shutting of the main cylinder. As the scaling or clogging of this equipment depends on the properties of the water, it is important to check and clean the equipment in advance. At the same time, the strainer for operating water line and the inside of the operating water tank should be cleaned. Next, remove the 3 socket cap screws securing the operating water disc. Then, loosen the socket set screw of the chamber cover. Set the jack and push bolts on the top of the vertical shaft and tighten the jack handle to draw out the operating water supply equipment. At this time, if it is difficult to take this out only by tightening the jack handle, it can easily be drawn out by lightly tapping the center of the jack with a hammer. This completes the removal of the operating water supply equipment. Next, draw out the vertical shaft from the frame. Remove the bearing cap. Using a T-type wrench, loosen and remove the 3 bolts fixing the bearing cover. Remove the bearing cover, the flat spring, and the spacer in this precise order. Screw evenly 3 push bolts into the holes of the bearing housing and tighten. The bearing housing can then be drawn out and removed from the vertical shaft. Install a lifting tool for the vertical shaft on the threaded part of the vertical shaft and lift up the shaft with a chain hoist to draw it out. Remove the steel ball, the spring seat, and the lower spring, which can be found in the lower bearing housing of the frame. This completes the removal of all the components inside the frame. There is no special order of dismantling each part drawn out from the frame, but here we will explain the dismantling and assembling procedures for the operating water supply equipment, the vertical shaft, the upper bearing housing, the horizontal shaft, and finally the gear pump. Depending on whether the self-jector is a total discharge type or a partial discharge type, the operating water supply equipment will slightly differ in structure. But the dismantling and assembling procedures are the same. Here, we will dismantle the operating water supply equipment of the partial discharge type. And after the dismantling, we will show you the differences between the total and the partial discharge type. First, unscrew the 6 bolts fixing the chamber cover together with spring washers or double-tongued washers. Then remove the chamber cover. Loosen the 3 socket cap screws fixing the operating water disc from below. Following this, the operating water nozzle, the operating water chamber, and the packing can be removed. This completes the dismantling of the operating water supply equipment. This is the operating water nozzle and operating water chamber of the total discharge type. And this is the operating water nozzle and operating water chamber of the partial discharge type. This is the partial discharge type's operating water chamber, which does not have a labyrinth. The total discharge type is provided with a labyrinth like this. The difference in both parts affect the discharge mechanism. Clean and check each part, and if necessary, replace the parts. Next, the operating water supply equipment is assembled in the reverse order of the dismantling procedure. Put the operating water chamber on the operating water nozzle and set a packing on the operating water disc. Since the bolt holes of the operating water nozzle, packing, and operating water disc are positioned to form an equilateral triangle, be sure to properly fit the position of the holes and incorporate the operating water nozzle into the operating water disc. Put the operating water chamber on the operating water nozzle and fit the bolt holes of the operating water disc. Then, tighten the socket cap screws firmly. Finally, install the chamber cover and tighten the bolts securely by putting in the spring washers or double-tongued washers. It's the assembling procedures for the operating water supply equipment. Set the vertical shaft on a vise. Tap the bearing case carefully with a plastic hammer to prevent damage and remove the bearing case. Screw evenly 3 push bolts into the holes of the angular bearing case and pull out the angular bearing case. Apply jack and push bolts. Then tighten the jack handle to draw out the ball bearings, collar, and the bearing cover at the same time. There are 2 collars installed within the SJ10 and the SJ15. The ball bearing is removable as it is set in the bearing case. Remove it with a caulking chisel. Turn over the vertical shaft and draw out the ball bearing. Release the lock nut from the tooth of the lock washer and loosen the lock nut with a hook spanner to remove the lock nut and lock washer. Taking care not to damage the vertical shaft, hit the bearing inner race with a caulking chisel and remove the ball bearing. This completes the dismantling work for the vertical shaft. Clean and check each part, and if necessary, replace the parts. Then begin assembling. First, install the ball bearing into the vertical shaft employing the shrinkage fit method. Insert the ball bearing into the bearing case. Then, immerse the case in heated oil. At this time, the ball bearings of the horizontal shaft is also heated in the oil. The optimum oil temperature is approximately 95 degrees centigrade. After confirming that both bearings have been heated, set the vertical shaft on the vise. Slip on the bearing cover, and then incorporate the ball bearing inserted in the bearing case. At this point, the collar is installed within both the SJ10 and SJ15, and the bearing is inserted into the vertical shaft. If the ball bearings do not slide in smoothly, drive in the bearing inner race with a caulking chisel. Next, put in the collar and incorporate the angular contact ball bearing, taking care not to insert it upside down. If the bearing does not slide in smoothly, lightly tap the bearing inner race with a caulking chisel. Following a brief period of time, turn over the vertical shaft and insert the ball bearing. After confirming that the bearing has completely cooled, tap the bearing inner race lightly with a caulking chisel and confirm that the ball bearing is completely in position. Then, put in the washer and tighten the lock nut with a hook spanner. Be sure to line the tooth of the washer with the indentation of the lock nut. Then, bend the tooth into the indentation. Tap the bearing case with a plastic hammer and set it evenly on the ball bearing. Turn over the vertical shaft and tap the angular contact ball bearing inner race with a caulking chisel, making sure that both ball bearings are properly set in the bearing cover. If the bearing cover can be turned by hand, tap it again with a caulking chisel. Tap the angular bearing case with a plastic hammer and set it in evenly. At this time, set the pin of the angular bearing case into the bearing case. This completes the assembling procedures for the vertical shaft. When dismantling the bearing housing, first loosen the 6 spring retainers. Take out the spring retainers, the upper springs, and the spring cases. Finally, remove the bearing sleeve. This completes the dismantling of the bearing housing. Clean and check each part, particularly the dimension of the upper springs and also for any rust. If necessary, replace the parts and then begin assembling. If any defect is found in one of the 6 springs, be sure to replace all 6 at the same time. Set the bearing sleeve with its thin part upward. Then set the spring cases, the springs, and the spring retainers. Then tighten them evenly. Installing the bearing sleeve, be careful not to mistake the upper side for the lower side. Last of all, be sure to tighten the spring retainers with a spanner. This completes the assembling of the bearing housing. Next, we will show you how to dismantle the horizontal shaft. First, place the shaft in a vise. Then, loosen the 4 bolts fixing the spiral gear and remove them together with the spring washer. Tap the spiral gear with a plastic hammer and remove it. Then, reset the horizontal shaft. Release the locked nut of the tooth of the lock washer. Loosen the lock nut and remove the lock washer and the collar. Set the jack and draw out the ball bearing. At this time, in order to protect the fitting part of the safety joint, insert the spacer Tighten the handle of the jack and draw out the ball bearing. Remove the bearing retainer. Turn over the horizontal shaft. Remove the key for the friction pulley. And pull out the collar. Set the jack and pull out the ball bearing. This completes the ordinary maintenance work, but when replacing the horizontal shaft and the gearbox, dismantle the horizontal shaft and the gearbox in accordance with the following procedures. Remove the lock nut and lock washer fixing the gearbox. Remove the horizontal shaft from the vise. Support the gearbox with a pipe and apply a wooden block on the side of the friction pulley of the horizontal shaft and hit it with a hammer to draw out the gearbox. This completes all the dismantling procedures for the horizontal shaft. Clean and check each part, and if necessary, replace the parts. Then start assembling. First, install the gearbox on the horizontal shaft. Set the gearbox on the pipe as shown here. Apply lubricating oil on the connecting part of the horizontal shaft, and setting a key in the groove of the gearbox, drive in the horizontal shaft from the pump side. In this case, be sure to also apply the wooden block as was done when removing the horizontal shaft. After inserting the gearbox completely, set the horizontal shaft on the vise. Then incorporate the lock washer and the lock nut. After tightening them, set the tooth of the lock washer.